What's up everyone? In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to get realistic sounding drums using a virtual instrument and MIDI. If you're watching this channel, you're probably a musician or producer who's looking to get better quality recordings in your home studio. And one way to definitely kill the vibe of a track is to have robotic, lifeless sounding drums. But if you're working out of a home studio, recording live drums is usually not an option. There's not enough space, not enough inputs, not enough mics, and it's loud and we have neighbors. And on top of that, I play a few instruments, but unfortunately drums is not one of them. So I'm going to share with you some tips that I use when I'm producing to make my tracks sound like a drummer is actually playing on them. So I'm using Ableton Live, and I made a track specifically for this video to kind of showcase my drum programming and also so that you can hear in context with some other instruments. So let's just listen to the whole track and then we'll solo the drums and then we'll break things down into how I got here. So that's the whole thing: drums, bass, electric guitar, and acoustic guitar. So let's just listen to the drums soloed. Cool, so as you can hear, sounds pretty good. Everything sounds pretty punchy. Sounds like there's a real drummer playing the track, I think. I think it sounds pretty realistic. So let's get into how I got here. So the first thing to do is like this video and subscribe to the channel if you're looking for more content like this. And if you enjoy this content, I'd love your support. And the first step to getting your drums to sound like this, number one is going to be your sample library. So I'm using Red Pack drums, and it's a Kontakt instrument. It works with the free Kontakt player, and this is the RCS Essentials pack. Now, I will tell you, they were nice enough to send me a copy of this sample library to use and to give my feedback on. So that's what I'm doing in this video. I will give my honest feedback on it, and honestly, this sample library is really great. Before this, I was using the Kontakt Library Studio Drummer, and I use that in a lot of my productions. You'll probably hear it in some of my other videos. But since I started using this, honestly, this is going to be what I'm going to be using from now on. The samples are just so good. It has just a lot of great features that I really think are going to be useful to me in my future productions, and hopefully you'll find them useful as well. So I'm going to go through a couple features of this sample library, of this VST, and I'll let you know the things that I like about it. And then we'll get into a little bit more of the MIDI editing and mixing and how I got to the final stage of this track to getting these drums sound like this. So again, this is Red Pack drums. This is a Kontakt instrument. It works with the free Kontakt player. So you would just have to purchase the sample library. You can do that from their website. I'll link that in the description. So let's go over a couple of things in this plugin. This is the dashboard page. So I have everything routed out through Kontakt into separate inputs into Ableton. You'll see that here on the side. I have these inputs for each of the drum channels. So let's start with the dashboard page. This is just your home base. MIDI page shows you all of the MIDI assignments. So what keys on your keyboard or your drum machine are going to play which samples. And this is really super easy to use. Like, it just shows you everything up front, and you can hit this little record icon here and play your own key or pad to map it. Really easy. I already changed a couple of them, but by default, they're pretty good, pretty well laid out. In this grooves panel, it comes with a bunch of MIDI files from different artists. I don't really use a lot of these, but sometimes I'll go in here to find fills. But some of these I've listened to have been really good and probably really useful for your songs. Then we have the mixer section, which is where you will primarily be doing a lot of your mixing of your different kinds of drums. And we'll get into all of these features here in a second. The drums page is something really unique, I think, in this plugin, is that it allows you to build your own drum kit, kind of like a real drummer would build their kit. Like you can choose the kick pedal, you can choose the shell of the drums, and then in the next tab, the snares tab, you can choose your snare, and then you can choose your type of cymbals. There's a lot of options here, but what I really like about it is that it gives you enough options that you can kind of make your own drum kit for your own sound, but not too many options that it's super overwhelming and that you spend hours, trying to tweak things. It's kind of just enough options to get you going, but enough to give you a really cool customized sound. So that's one of the features I really like. So those are all the tabs. The instrument comes with a bunch of good presets. I usually don't really like to use presets. So I started with the start from scratch preset and I built my own drum kit from there. I chose my own drums, my own snare, my own cymbals, and I mixed everything the way I wanted it to. So that's how I went about using this plugin, but there's tons of great presets there if you're just looking to jump in and find something usable from the start. So let's go into this mixer panel. Right off the bat, you have an all tab. So this is your home base with mixing. And if you want to keep it really simple, you can just stay here in this all tab and adjust each one of these channels to mix your drums. And then you have a bunch of other mic options if you really want to tailor your sound. You have your close mics, which would be the mics actually on the drums, your overhead mics, your stereo overheads, a room mic, and then you have these 3 extra miking options, mixing options: character, squash, and beef. For my kit, I'm using the close mics, I'm using the overheads, the room mics, I'm using the character. I'm not using the squash, and I'm using the beef a little bit. And basically I have these mapped out into tracks in Ableton. So over here, I have the close kick, snare, hi-hat, tom 1, tom 2, tom 3, tom 4, close cymbals. And then that overhead tab is all going here. The room is going here. And the comp track is that character tab. So that's how I have mine routed. It's super easy to do right down here in the output. You can just route to your Kontakt mixer and then out into Ableton through the Ableton mixer. Super easy to do from this plugin. And this is the same way I had it set up in Kontakt Studio Drummer. And again, I think it just gives you a lot more options for mixing later on. I like to have that control in my DAW. But if you just want to have it out into one stereo MIDI track, you can of course do that as well. And just use the mixer here to mix everything going out to your single stereo track. So the things I really like about this plugin is the drum designer is super cool. There's a lot of good mic options and also built-in effects. I didn't use a ton of them, but the built-in EQ and effects are really cool in this plugin as well. So you can really just get everything you need without doing any mixing or using any third-party plugins in your DAW. Everything is right here in the plugin. But again, personally, I just like to have a little bit more control and use some third-party plugins that I'm familiar with. And probably the best feature that I really like is this hit strength slider. It's kind of like an intensity slider. It allows you to globally control the intensity of your MIDI. So let's solo this. So when I'm playing back this MIDI clip, I can go from subtle to powerful. So super cool feature in this plugin. I think it's really unique. I haven't really seen it in any other kind of drum virtual instruments. And the way I use that is I will map it to, I have a hardware controller. I have it mapped to a fader so I can use it that way. And I can automate it here in Ableton. So I have it kind of this intro, it's, building an intensity. And then this section is at around 80%. Gets a little bigger for the fills. It gets even bigger for the second section. And I'm kind of using it as a way to build dynamics in a song without having to go in and adjust the individual MIDI notes. Instead of doing that, I can just kind of globally control with this automation with that slider in the virtual instrument. So it saves a lot of time. I can just have all my MIDI be, about the same velocity through all the sections and then just change that one control. So there's a lot of really great features in this virtual instrument. And apart from that, it just sounds really good. And you can go to their website and see the work they did to getting these high quality samples. The samples just sound really good and they're dynamic and there's a lot of different articulations and it's just really a great library. And I'll give you guys a little finger drumming demo here so you can kind of see what this kit can do with all of the variations and articulations that you can use that are available to you when you play this live with your MIDI controller or however you're programming it. So now that you've heard this virtual instrument, let's go over some other tips with MIDI editing and mixing that you can use no matter what drum VST you're using. So let's zoom into this MIDI clip here so we can see the MIDI. This is this section. Let's listen to it one more time. So one thing that I'll do when I program MIDI, and usually I'll do a mix of clicking in notes and playing it live with a keyboard or a MIDI controller. But one thing that I'll do is I'll almost always keep the kick and the snare quantized on the grid. So you can see these are right on the grid, or sometimes I'll slip a snare before or after to give it a little bit more live of a feel, but pretty much always I'll have the kick and snare locked onto the grid, quantized. And then using the cymbals, fills, I'll kind of give those more of a live feel by having them off the grid. So most of the times I'll click in the kick and the snare and just get my basic groove down. And then I'll play all of these cymbal things and play some of the fills. And I'll quantize them just a little bit so they're still, in time. But if we zoom in here, you can see that they're not all right on the grid. So just having a couple things off the grid kind of gives you more of that live feel. You don't have to have everything off the grid. And also it just depends on how rigid and on time you want your music to sound. Depends on the genre too a little bit. But one thing I'll always try to do is keep the kick and the snare on the grid. Everything else kind of loosely on the grid. So I'll give you some more humanized elements into your MIDI drumming productions. The other thing with the kick and snare is I'll have pretty consistent velocities for kick in the snare. And for cymbals and fills, I'll usually, mix those up. But as far as kick and snare, they're usually always going to be the same velocity throughout the whole song, especially with this virtual instrument, now that I have that intensity slider to kind of control the dynamics. And what that does is just helps keep a consistent tone with the core of the instrument, which is the kick and the snare. And then when we get to processing and mixing, you want to make sure that your kick and your snare are all the same volume and they're not cutting out, because those are the things that are really driving the drum part of your song. Even when live drums are recorded, engineers and mixers will go in and adjust kick and snare and make sure that they're all about the same volume and dynamics so that, you get a even cohesive mix. The other thing with MIDI is that when you're doing fills or making drum parts, make sure that they sound realistic, like something an actual drummer would play. And you can do this by listening to other drummers, going to YouTube and see how drummers play, and really pay attention to how they fill things, how they play grooves, because having a bunch of drum parts on top of each other that are really impossible to play live is going to make your drum track sound robotic and unrealistic, because it's not really something a drummer would actually play. So make sure whatever your grooves are, make sure that they're pretty close to what could be played live. For example, I have kick, I have snare. This is a hi-hat pedal. This is a ride. And here's a crash here. So I wouldn't have necessarily all of these elements on top of each other at one time, because the drummer only has two hands. They can only play two things with their hands, and they have 2 feet, right? So layering a bunch of drum sounds on top of each other is not always the way to go. Keeping it simple is sometimes a little better. And again, it's going to contribute to your track feeling and sounding more realistic. And with whatever virtual instrument you're using, there's probably a groove library. Just like in this Red Pack drums, there's a bunch of MIDI clips that I could drag into my DAW and use. So if you're not a drummer, you have no idea how drums sound, go to those parts in your virtual instrument where you can take some of those MIDI files and drag them into your DAW. For this song, actually, I use this fill here and this fill. So these two are both from the library of Red Pack drums. This fill and this fill. And they sound realistic because a real drummer made them. I also have a ton of experience just in a live setting as a music director, watching drummers and also asking drummers to do certain things. Over the years, kind of have gotten a better sense of how drummers play and what they can actually play and what it sounds like when they play certain things. So that's really good knowledge to have. So some mixing tips. This track, I already did the majority of the mixing with. So the drums that you're hearing now, I've already spent some time mixing them and getting them to sound really good. And with this, what I can do with Ableton is I can just save this group of tracks as a template, and I can drag it into a session every time I want to use drums. It's going to have the same preset, the same plugins that I've used to mix it. So going back into Red Pack drums, the virtual instrument, I'm using a couple things here on the kick and snare. So the kick, I have a transient designer. It's just giving me a little bit more attack and kind of a little less sustain, so it's a bit more punchy. And then a little bit of parallel compression here on just the kick. I think that's really all I did with this plugin. But on my drum group here, I have a compressor, this rubber band compressor from Mixland. I put this on all my drums, whether they're live drums or electric drums. This thing just really does wonders on drums. And this is the preset that I'll pretty much do for every drum track that I do. So look at this preset here, screenshot this, use these settings, and it'll sound amazing on your drums. So a compressor, and I have the mix set about 50, so it's parallel compression there. And then I also have a limiter. I'm using the Apogee Soft Limit. This is a free plugin that you can get. And I have this after the compressor. And basically what this is doing is just getting the peaks of the drums so that I can push the volume even louder when I get to the mixing with other tracks and the mastering. So I'll play the drum track and you can see what these two plugins are doing here. And here is that drum track without this. Now with. So a big part of that is just volume. There's a bit of a volume boost going on with the soft limiter, just because the Red Pack virtual instrument I found to be a little quiet going into my DAW. So there's some volume boosting going on there for sure, but there's also a lot of heavy compression, and the limiting is contributing to a big part of the sound of this drum track. And when you get that heavy compression going on, you're altering the transients of the track. And by altering those transients, you're actually getting more of a live feel. It's actually giving punch and character to your drum track. So don't be afraid to use compression. Don't be afraid to use limiting on your drum bus. That's one of my biggest steps to getting my drums to sound live and punchy, is just heavy compression and limiting. So the last tip I'll talk about is using reverb to kind of design a space for your drums to sit in your mix. And this is the other thing for getting realistic sounding drums. You don't want them to be dry. You want them to sound like they're actually recorded in a studio. So I'll show you what I have going on here. And this is another reason why I like to split out the drum parts like this in Ableton, so that I can use reverbs like I do any of my other tracks in my session. So I have a reverb here. This is Valhalla Vintage Verb, the drum plate preset. Edited a little bit, but it's just a short plate reverb here. And I have the snare, hi-hat, and toms being sent to that post-fader send. And so let's hear that. So just a little reverb on those direct mics of the kit. I'm not sending any of the cymbals, definitely not the overhead or the room or the comp channel to those. Just a little bit of verb on those few pieces of the drum kit, kind of give it some space. So here's that with the whole kit. So you can hear when I take it out, you definitely lose some of that space. And then the other reverb plugin I have is kind of a different plugin. This is by UAD. It's the Sound City Studios plugin. And this plugin is really unique because it does a lot of things. It can, when you use this remic mode, it basically replaces your mics with the virtual mics of the plugin. And it kind of does some modeling there. Definitely check it out. There's a lot to it, and it does more than drums. It does guitars, vocals, all kinds of things. And I had it off because it really takes up a lot of CPU. So this is usually the last thing I'll do, the last part of my mixing process. I'll add this plugin. Basically what it's doing is I'll put it in reverb mode, and I'll put it on a send like this. And again, I'll send all of my direct mics to it. This time I included the kick and the cymbals. I didn't include the overhead or room, just my direct mics, because these are kind of already doing a similar thing. So just the direct mics. And basically what it's doing is it's taking these mics here. I muted the close mic, but I have these two room mics that I have mixed in, and you can choose different kinds of mics, how far away they are in the room. This plugin does a lot of really cool things, but what I've found is that it just adds kind of an extra dimension of space in room on my drum tracks, and on a lot of different tracks actually, but specifically for drum tracks, I've been finding it super useful. So let's hear it. This is what it's actually doing. So basically I'll mix that into the overall mix of the track. So let's see, drums, and then let's listen. We still have our other verb on. Let's just fade this in slowly. You'll kind of get the vibe and hear how it's contributing to the sound. Yeah, so you can hear much boomier kick. The snares just has more room. It's really hard to explain what this plugin actually does, but just mixing it into taste really just adds another dimension of space to your drums. And this is another thing that's going to allow you to get a really realistic sound out of a virtual instrument with MIDI. So let's hear this track again with all of the other instruments in context, utilizing all of these tips that I've talked about in this video. Let's hear how it sounds. Now, one more time, let's just hear the drum track soloed with all of these tips implemented. See how that sounds. So those are all the tips I have for you in this video. Thank you so much for tuning in and checking this out. Again, like this video, subscribe. If you have any other tips for getting realistic drums, please drop those in the comments to share with me and everyone else tuning into this video. And I'll see you guys next time.